We're gonna get started here in just a second. Welcome. We're glad you're here. I'm glad to be here. I'm Dr. Brit Terry. I am our program coordinator for the English department here at SWU. Little teeny bit of background about me and how I got here and how I got to be like, well, I won't tell you how I got here. I drove in a car with my daughter. But that is how I got here today. But just a little bit about my connection with education. So I was in English education major as an undergraduate, and I thought that's what I wanted to do until I student taught full time, and then I thought, oh, what am I doing? So then I took a little bit of a detour. I did my MA in English, and then my mentor at my undergraduate institution gave me an opportunity to teach as an adjunct, and I loved it. I just adored it. The things I loved about it were meeting new students and meeting them where they are, and hearing their stories, and then you could see their progress. So that's what attracted me to the field. I worked as an adjunct and as an admissions counselor for my undergraduate for about 5 years, and then I thought, okay, I want to keep doing this. So I went back, did my PhD in literature. So my specialty is Victorian literature, but this entire time, since probably been 17 years I've been teaching at post-secondary level, I've always taught some kind of writing, some kind of thinking about writing kinds of classes. Here at SWU, I've also been able to teach some courses in our education major, and that's just made me extremely happy. And so I think that's why Dr. Strike asked me to do this, so I am super glad to be here. All right, so today what we're going to do is kind of talk a little bit about writing with research and how to do that critically. So I've got a couple of ways for us to think about it. I am an over-planner, so we may run out of time before we get through all the things, but I am happy to answer questions for you today, tomorrow, whenever. This is my email address, and you're going to get a handout later with my email address on it too, so I am glad to answer any questions you might have about writing or life or whatever. So I'm happy to do that, so that is there for you. Okay, sound good? All right, so I told you I was an English teacher, so I'm going to get you to do a little bit of writing first. So I'm also in the middle of being the craft lady at the Vacation Bible School. So I kind of just, cool colors, and practice my handwriting, that kind of thing. So I've got some prompts here for you. And so what we're going to do is, if you're loosely grouped with some neighbors, I'm just going to walk around, give you a prompt. You can, I would say, 5 or 6 of you. What you can do is just kind of, you've got a scenario here. So take a look at the scenario on the card. I'm going to write some questions up here. But the first one is kind of like, all right, you have this project to do. Where do you start? So that's the first question. And I'll write the other questions up. Give you some time to kind of think about this. You can write it down. You can, as my students always say, do we all have to write it? You can, but you don't have to. So just kind of a way to sort of thinking and talking.
Start by looking at my space. that's really
I mean, I would people where.
Student feedback.
I think that goes back to where you started.
Oh, that's right. Funding sources are supportive. Grants. You start. You know, like, if you're. Companies and things will do, they can put their logos on the side.
I'm trying to look at like some of that library. Where the public. Right.
The students at the college library, they're allowed to use. Public library. That's part of the. Part of the student. So that's.
Okay, if you're still chatting, kind of bring that to close. So just some kind of quick feedback here. I ask you first, where do you start? And that, again, is a pretty open, vague question, and intentionally so. So I'll just kind of ask groups individually, tell me what the scenario is you had, and then that first question, where did you start if you had this situation? You don't go for it.
Do you want us to read our scenario?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Our scenario, you're designing a new media center at your school.
Where would you start with that?
We decided that we would look at the budget and the space that we had, and also find out student feedback and needs, teacher feedback and needs, and then maybe visit some media centers to see what's being done.
Great. Friends in the back.
We had, your child or nephew niece is choosing to be in a wax museum at school. And so we said we would first start by asking the child for more information on the assignments.
Always good.
Yeah. And then moving on to the teacher.
Yeah.
And, needing a little more information to take our next steps.
Okay, good. Friends in the very back.
Ours was, you're working on a landscape project at your church and you want to include native plants. So our first thought was kind of broad, like to Google what the native plants were. And then we kind of went down to the details of like, well, first you have to figure out if the budget, and then you have to figure out, is this just for spring, fall, summer, or winter? Because certain plants die at certain times, and then would you replace plants as you go through the season? So we would talk to the nursery about the cost of landscaping and see how much it would cost for them to do it rather than us. And what else did I forget? Our first step would be to first figure out the budget with the church and exactly what is their vision and what it should look like.
Okay, great. Next.
You're redesigning a kitchen in a 75-year-old farmhouse.
So we said that we would brainstorm designs first, and then we will talk to a designer, which will be in contact with the contractor, and then the contractor will look at the home and tell us the coding issues, or the coding, to bring the house up to code
Yep.
from 75 years ago to this point.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Okay. Last but not least.
You're hosting a dinner party for 25 people. 2 guests have allergies, 1 is a vegan. So we first said we would find out what the allergies were and check with the vegan to see what they do like to eat. Go from there.
Yeah. All right, so you each had some one, that one was based in reality. I was telling them, we just took a group of students to a conference. One has a gluten allergy, another one is a vegan, and then 3 people who really didn't care. So, and we only have 1 cart. So it's kind of like, okay, where can we take all of us that we will be able to eat and everyone will survive after this delicious meal? So just kind of thinking about ways that we do research every day, whether we're aware of it or not. So some of these things are way more practical. If you had a big project, you obviously would have to think about things like budget, the needs of your students, your parishioners at the church. Do you just get to pick whatever you want to, or like who's in charge, and is the, teeny little old lady who sits in the front pew gonna get mad if you plant the wrong kind of flowers in the wrong place? Not that that ever happens. Or with an allergy, it could be a serious complication. So the implications of those things. So we do research all the time, whether we really are conscious of it or not. So I wanted to kind of get you kind of thinking about the research you're going to have to do. That a lot of times it does things like satisfy our curiosity. I don't know if you're like me, but I could spend tons of time just thinking through and, I don't know, thinking about what kinds of curtains are available so that I could put these on I love that stuff. I was on a college trivia team. So yeah, I spent a lot of time learning facts and things that I thought were interesting. Obviously, you can do things like finding practical solutions to everyday problems and the ways that we kind of go about doing that. And then for your project that you're beginning work on, that you're already turning your wheels over, you can join a critical conversation. And that's the important thing here when you're thinking about your dissertation and how that project's going to work. I always, it was hard for me to kind of think about initially that I'm just writing this, as my grandpa used to call it, your paper. How's your paper going? Well, Grandpa, it's more like a book, but it's fine. Like my little bitty project sometimes felt like a drop in the ocean. But if I thought about it, that it was joining a voice is a voice joining a conversation that has been ongoing. Like I said, I was 19th century scholar, so a lot of people have written a lot of stuff about Charles Dickens and Tennyson and Stevenson, a lot. So to think about, well, I'm getting to talk with these people who have written these things and have done it for a long time. So as you're thinking about your project and incorporating research and thinking about how that works, your voice is going to be an important voice in a larger conversation. And a lot of you, I imagine, are going to have some really specific listeners, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute. But things to remember, that your voice is unique. What you have to say about your particular project has not yet been said. And that voice needs to be heard. And if it's only to the people at your school, in your family, your dissertation committee, that's not a small thing. It's really important. And yeah, that your voice is important. And for me, this took a little while for me to sort of absorb, because I think we tend to think about creative writing as one kind of thing and scholarly writing as another kind of thing, when actually they're not. There are different rules that those things play by, but all writing is creative. And in doing so, you are participating in the same kind of creativity that is imprinted on us because we are made in God's image. God is a creative being. God made all of us, all those little leaves, all these things. And like God, we want to make things too. And this dissertation project that you're working on, which sometimes it won't be fun. Yeah, I said it. It's not going to be fun sometimes. In fact, it's going to be the opposite of fun. I'd be glad to share stories of my unfun dissertation stories, but it is a creative thing. You are making something that hasn't existed yet. And if you keep that little thought tucked into your brain somewhere, that your creative process is mirroring God's creative process, sometimes it makes those not hard days a little bit easier. So that's kind of a frame for you to think about here when you think about why we're researching. All right, so some of the things we've already kind of mentioned, and this stuff you probably already know, so I'll sort of glance over this to get to some more specific stuff for you to think about. And I will also say here, if you have a question, please stop me, because I can certainly expand on stuff that you want more information about. So please feel free to do that. So we kind of think about two kinds of sources. And some of the stuff you may be doing in a little bit, I'm going to ask you more particularly what y'all are working on, or at least thinking about working on. Primary research. So a lot of you library people mentioned, okay, I would talk to the students and see what they care about. Or wax museum people, you would talk to the student who is participating in the wax museum. Tell me what your teacher said. Or you would go to another kitchen maybe and say, okay, this is how it works here. This is what it looks like. All right. Those kinds of things are primary research, where you are doing the work here. These are first-hand collection methods. So surveys, my favorite. I love those things. I love writing them. I love collecting them. I will take the ones, even when the telemarketer calls me, I will almost always go, yes, let me tell you what I think. It's weird, but it is what it is. If y'all have a survey, I will take it. These are terrific. There are tons of tools you can use to do these. And I've done paper ones and SurveyMonkey and stuff like that. And you can make cool charts. Love it. Interviews, primary sources. So you want to talk to the people who are going to be using the media center you're working on. Well, maybe it's a good idea to ask them what they want. Now, that might not be your only one, but it's a good starting place to think about, all right, what are we going to use this space for? Experiments. So thinking about those, making sure they're compliant with the right kinds of rules too, of course, but these are ways, if you're going to design an experiment that works, you're collecting data firsthand. Other things I think about that don't necessarily get in there, but if you're creating graphics, if you're taking photographs, that's also primary research if you are the person doing that work. And a lot of times that research we don't necessarily think about, but isn't important. So if you include a video that you have shown to demonstrate part of your project, then that works too. Those are all things you can think about and talk about. And then there's secondary research. So in my field, this is a lot of what I do. I read what other people have said about the thing. So we have a summer reading group with our English majors. They picked the book. They chose Jane Eyre, which couldn't have made me any happier. This is my favorite book. So we're like reading some reviews of the novel as it came out to kind of make some comparisons. So that's an example of maybe some primary or secondary research. Important books, articles, charts, photographs, texts, other surveys, things like that, that other people have made that may support your idea, or at least other people can learn about it through your work. Okay, so when you're getting to this point, and now we're going to talk a little bit too, when you're starting to narrow down what kinds of research you're going to use, you may already know, like, oh, totally already, I know the person I'm going to talk to, I've already written a survey, or I am going to talk to my media specialist at my school as soon as we get home. There are stakeholders involved in your dissertation besides yourself. And this is a good way to start thinking about where to steer and what kinds of research to select. Okay. Tell me about, when you hear the word stakeholder, what do you think about?
I just think of the word invested.
Okay.
Somebody that's invested in whatever.
Yep. Other thoughts?
People who have a stake, they'll be affected by it in some way.
Yeah. Yeah. So people who are invested, and then people who are affected. Those are good ways of kind of thinking about that. So when you're writing this dissertation, you've got stakeholders who are involved. One of them is you. You're incredibly involved. You care a lot. So does your committee, right? So like the people who are fussing at you to turn in the chapter, or making sure, hey, you need to revise this part, or what about that APA format? Everybody's favorite. Like, make sure you get the formatting right. So you've got that sort of thing. But there are other people who are connected to your project that you have to kind of think about. And this is, again, a way for you to start thinking about what kinds of research you want to do. So right now, what I'd like for you to do is think about, and you can talk about this with other people. So just briefly, stakeholders are groups affected by your issue, indirectly affected, who can control or regulate aspects of your issue. This is definitely a committee, but it might also be your supervisor, whoever that is. How much are you getting some time to do this thing? Is it the people you live with, aka like maybe your own children? My child is 3. She controls some of the stuff I do. I hate to admit it. People who might consume your project, so somebody who's going to read it, somebody who might benefit from it. So if you're creating something that somebody's out of this project that somebody will visit, like maybe you want to create a writing center at your school. You've got people who are customers or consumers to kind of think about it that way. People who don't know about your thing, but are nevertheless connected to it. All right. So here, if you haven't already done this, the same folks you just worked with, and you talk a little bit about the project you're working on. And maybe say, all right, there's some people I know who are interested in my topic. Who else do you think might be interested in this? That last kind of stakeholder, the people who are affected by it but don't even know that it's a thing. Somebody in your group might go, oh yeah, what about the women who work in our cafeterias? They may be affected by what we're doing because we're going to take space out of the kitchen area if we're going to build a writing center. See if you can come up with 10 stakeholders who are interested in what you're going to be talking about. I'm going to drift around here in just a minute and see what you have to say and hear a little bit about your projects too, because I'm curious.
Actual dissertation?
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah. So each of you can make a list for yourselves. Who care? And there's going to be some crossover. So your principal's probably going to care. If you're the principal, your assistant principals are going to care. So I'll come around and clarify and see what kinds of questions you might have.
That's like the core thing. Are you some districts? Some districts are doing it, but the way that these work is I wish, right? Oh, yeah. But I want to see you guys hear it with there's that first grade, second grade, and that third grade. Yeah, that year. That helped them, you know. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
curriculum. Down the line, like I said, maybe it's good, and the administration decides, okay, this is something we want to work on this. Send it to the teachers about this, because, you know, they may need to support the fact that they're not, you know. Yeah, yes.
So what are your ideas?
Student has to. Public school and moving.
We're going that direction.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So even that momentary switch concentration, what does that do? Process.
This is what I meant.
For ones that have tried or
Yeah, and it's. Build the
I guess it's here on our side right now, so I just get it. It's all hard. So they have to take out, and then if it's down, that's just like. But do you remember?
Yeah.
My teacher's got a lawyer, we haven't reviewed the textbook yet, but that is. They can try to get it back, so that they're using their lives over there. You know, their technology card.
Protectable market.
And I wanted to know more about the background, about and talk about. Was that I mean, I didn't know if that would be
How well they do it.
Okay, so keep talking. Great. So we were just talking about my started is the success of first year induction teachers, particularly with the focus on potential that they are actually compared with. And, you know, are there some things that you need to be looking for when you place two people together? I know there's the state training, the state mentor training, you know, just what are some of the factors that will make that relationship successful, but also ultimately make the induction teacher. I'm here, I'm at Edwards Middle School. Yeah, right now.
Mine is, the youth it's like when they want to move, so it's suspension, high-school suspension, anything that removes them from instruction. Goes in the hall, goes to the office, you're suspended from school. So, yeah, it's the most big. I'm in Anderson, I'm district 2. In the middle school.
You think about 40 years old, I would.
High school, like, yeah, middle's just the.
Because of the age group. But they have the cognitive ability.
I think my personality is very sensitive, like, the same type of people that value academic.
And you can't take they don't mean to act that
So I'm looking at it is 5,000 students a year on 7. I didn't know it was really big. I did grad school. Dr. Foster. Dr. Brown. Dr. Richard. I didn't know these. In fact, she said I was one of, if not the best places. She does stuff in the Well, no, yeah,
Zoning and I.
and even just around the sort of, what I would call the downtown.
Initially started with the achievement gaps. Oh, I got there.
She has
So we should see a lot of things firsthand as far as, you know, how this.
People have to use space and it shouldn't be much. Other states have been doing stuff, so.
Do you have even?
Oh, no, it's pretty cool. We're not as far as they are as far as.
All those are stakeholders. Well, the I-95.
Yes.
When I was.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's what I'm saying.
No, but I don't know if we've seen the same video, but I see that. Like how, what is the specific, is it turnover or factors that contribute to that?
Yeah.
So it's not even you place the way. Favorite teachers, they program this or whatever you do. Okay.
Ours has been heavy, like that.
That's what I wondered.
It's still programmed. You start to hear.
When I take a class, where, you know,
Transition
So this shot, the first year I was kind of following what they always had done.
teaching.
Yeah.
Okie dokie, so. All right. It sounds like we've had really productive conversations, and it seems like talking to people who aren't necessarily doing the thing you're doing, be that in a different kind of school, a different focus, that you were able to hear some other people who might be interested in your topic besides you. Because I think the process of researching and writing a dissertation can be incredibly isolating, and you feel kind of lonely sometimes, because you are the person that's got to write this thing. But this kind of talking with other colleagues is going to be super important, and you can see that, like, you care passionately about that thing. Other people do too. They don't know about it, and that's where the disconnect is. So that's you bridging that gap, joining that scholarly conversation, saying, I know something about that. Or some of y'all are thinking about younger kids, or even like middle school people, and there are high school people who you're on the other end of that trajectory. We're thinking about how teachers work in this. How can we build these bridges? And it seems like these conversations are super productive. The other things for you to think about, which I did hear, are thinking about community partners. So some of y'all are thinking about behavior and something like bad behavior sometimes. Like, there are people in the community who do care about that, who do want students to do well, but they don't know what to do about that. Those are these kids today, people.
Right.
That is so not helpful. Let's just say that. These kids today don't do what we want them to do. Okay, well, maybe it's you. I don't know. So, like, thinking about those people who are saying that, you might have an answer to these kids today. Well, guess what? I've done a lot of research. I've talked to a lot of people. And here's the thing we could do for the kids today, who will be your doctors and your nurses and your lawyers and your plumbers and your air conditioner people. Like, those kids are going to be helping you. So they need to be invested. So thinking about outside your school too. All right, so we did this. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to have to, like, fast forward and go. All right, so when I was writing my dissertation, and when you get to the point when you're doing that work, a lot of times it's hard for you to separate what you have discovered with what you have read and what you think is obvious and what other people have no idea about. You live with it, you think about it enough that you're like, of course this is what we should do. Of course this is what people in Victorian England thought about. Okay, yeah. Other people don't know that. So you've got to be able, in your dissertation, to think about it. This is the best metaphor I could come up with, as a talk show. And I'm telling my age a little bit, and I did my undergrad at Winthrop. I lived in Rock Hill for 10-ish years. So at 4 o'clock every day, Oprah would come on. And I'm like, yes, I'm gonna get home and watch Oprah. What's she gonna talk about today? And as you all know, it was very clear that no matter who she had on, so she had, one time she interviewed Cormac McCarthy, which he's an author who never, ever, ever, ever gave interviews. Certainly not on TV. She had him on TV, okay? She had Paul McCartney on, like, and sort of she fangirled out, like, I can clearly remember that because I was super jealous. But there was never any doubt that this was Oprah's show, right? Like, even if she had the most famous human being on the planet on the show, it was always Oprah's show. So for you to think about when you're writing this dissertation, it's your show. You've got to incorporate the research because your stakeholders are going to need to be convinced sometimes, because they're not automatically going to go like, oh, sweet, yes, excellent idea. Let me give you this blank check to go do your thing. So you've got to be able to pitch to them and understand, like, I've done my homework, I've done my research, I've written this book. Dr. Schatzberger has read this and says it's awesome. But your audience doesn't necessarily know that. And it sometimes is easy for the research to take over and say, see, this is what everybody else said, instead of, no, this is what I think about that research too. Think about your voice in the conversation. So to make sure you do that, I always think about dissertation as talk show. Okay. It doesn't have to be Oprah. Like, I watch a lot, well, we just moved and we don't have cable again. It makes me a little bit sad. Partly because I love sports. I'm a horrible athlete, but I like sports. I like watching sports commentary. Like, I love the NBA too. So like, now that the finals are over, I'm like, oh gosh, well, I guess I don't need cable because they're not. So I like watching sports commentary. There would not be an ESPN if we didn't like doing research and analyzing. Those shows work the same way. Whatever show it is, think about a talk show. What did they start with? What did Oprah always begin with? And or your favorite talk show?
Tell you what they're talking about.
Yeah, they tell you what they're talking about. They have some kind of introduction to the guest, even if it's the most famous human being on the planet. At the time when Oprah had Paul, like, because we're best friends, I guess we can call him Paul McCartney on, she was like, this is Paul McCartney. He was in a band called the Beatles. And you're like, okay, good, thank you. She always introduces the guest. You got to do that too. Now, it would be there are some boring talk shows where the host just talks. But typically the host asks good questions for the guest to open up and talk. So I think that's probably one of the reasons that Cormac McCarthy was like, sure, I'll go on the Oprah show, and then I'll like disappear to the New Mexico desert for the next 3 decades. It's because he knew she has authority, and she asks good questions, and she's going to let him say his thing. So that's the other thing the second piece in doing this. You introduce your guest, you let that guest talk, and you ask the good questions that opens up the source. And just like every other talk show, and this even counts for the ones like Jerry Springer. Not that I've ever watched it. I hear that at the end.
I can let you know because I've watched it.
What happens at the end of every Jerry Springer show?
Yeah.
Yes, he has like his little moment.
Final thought.
Yes, where he's like, okay, guys, don't get extremely intoxicated in public because it's a bad idea or whatever. Like he gives you some words of advice.
He tries to redeem himself.
He does, and say like, okay, here's why I had these people on TV. And here's what you should not do, or what you should do. He gives you some kind of advice. He doesn't just go, hey, wasn't that weird? The end. Like, he doesn't just close it. He gives his commentary. That is the pattern your dissertation needs to follow. You have got to think about it as your show. You introduce your source. You can do that by quotation. You talk about where it comes from. It can be a quotation, it can be a paraphrase, it can be a summary, according to you. Then you let the source talk. You're asking it a good question. You're using that to further your own thesis. And at the end of this paragraph, on each section, you've got to close with your commentary and your citation if you're citing something. But that's the way it should work through the whole document. You're going to start with a literature review. You're going to incorporate your research, whether that's primary research, you're interviewing teachers who are on the ground, working with students who are problem students. You're asking middle school girls what words they use to describe themselves when they're in the science classroom, or what they think about science. You're talking to parents of 4-year-olds who have a limited budget and would send their kids to a pre-K, but they just can't do it. You're using that evidence in the middle, But then you're gonna end, this is on the macro level and the micro level, paragraphs where you say, okay, this is important because this is why I introduced this source. You're gonna close this dissertation with saying, see, stakeholders, people who've read this, people I'm gonna put this research in front of. I have an interesting intervention that I'm either playing off of, borrowing from, and changing, disagreeing with. That's always so fun when you get to say, yeah, these people, they have a pretty good idea, but I have a better one, and here it is. That's how you're gonna close it with, okay? So using research to support your talk show, just like Oprah has used her early journalism stuff, her small, teeny tiny little show to like this gigantic global empire, that's how you have to think about it. Your dissertation is your show. Skip this part. I also used to have a mild obsession with America's Next Top Model, like a lot of those things. Any of those panel shows, they're doing it too. So when they say at the end of The Voice, like, wow, well, I guess this is more American Idol, a little pitchy. Those evaluations, if they just let those people get up there and sing, we wouldn't have these superstars coming from these shows. Your writing has got to always follow with some critical evaluation and some work after it. So when you start thinking about it, I'm going to talk a little, let me tell you this part and then I'll sort of talk you through it. Observation, highlight, and analysis. When I was writing my dissertation, I had to come up with a formula because I kept either summarizing things, I would just say what other people said, or I would just like throw in all my thoughts without any kind of commentary. And it was a jumbled, gigantic, annoying, I think, Corey, probably for my dissertation director, mess. So I had to come up with a formula that made me make sure I was writing like analytical prose and keeping on track. And the ways I did that, I thought about this. So I thought about making an observation. This was like a teeny little bit of my thesis coming out. It was an interpretation of evidence, and it answered the question, what do you think about this source? What do you think about this information? How does it work? This was a topic sentence for a parent, like I had to get it down. Elementary school teachers, you were like waiting this all the time. Like, how do you write a paragraph? How do you start it? This is how you do it. You have to have an opinion. You have to have, well, what do I think about this? Make an observation. Then I would provide some evidence. This is where you make sure you're keen with your citation formats, that you are using the information you have and making sure you cite it as you should. This is where you do quotation, paraphrase, summary. You use a graph. You refer to a photograph. You think about a figure that someone has drawn. It might be your own research. So you've got to come back and say, in the survey that we conducted at this school, this is what parents said. This is where you find the evidence kind of question. So what do you think about this? Where do I find the answer? And this last bit is probably the most important, and that is the explaining part. This is the sentence or sentences that pull everything together. This is where you explain why this evidence matters. Why did you use this source? Out of all the things in all the world you could have talked about, why this source? Why this survey? I literally, in writing my dissertation, had to set up these sentences that were constructed this way. This is important because I'm using this because you need to know this, because I would write all my sentences like that and then go back and chop out that front part of the sentence, because what was after it was really what I was saying. But that formula, I think this, so if you wrote a sentence like this is important because it shows how students perceive themselves. I would write sentences like this and then I would go back and chop out that thing. This is the analysis. You need to know this because I'm bringing this to your attention, because that's how I assured myself I was writing analytical prose. Now, this is not the best sentence on the planet. And, oh man, revision, so hard, so not fun sometimes, because you've already said what you're going to say, but then you got to go do it again. Like, and it feels like it's never over. Mm-hmm. My mentors in undergrad, Dr. Jones, always told me, good writing isn't ever finished, it just has a deadline. You just got to turn it in at some point. Thank you, as a person who loves this, checking off things. This got me to making sure I was doing the right kind of work. And that's how, when you get into the thick of this, one of the things, my tiny little tidbit of information that might help you. The other thing, and this is another, like a little quick practical thing, and then I think it's almost time for y'all to switch up. In regard to organizing my ideas, I am old school, and I will pitch to you the simple notebook. I finally just found a kind of notebook I like, spiral bound, college ruled. My favorite little pen, this thing. And what I did, this is, 2.5 years of this. I would find the source, either print it, online, whatever, it was a book. I would write the citation out by hand at the top, so I knew what source it was. And then I would just take my notes in the notebook, making sure, like if I used quotations, that I put the page it was on, or if I summarized it, I had this little code system. And then I'd write these little brief, like, okay, use this in chapter 1 when you're talking about Tennyson's poetry, or use this when you're talking about Kipling's short story, whatever it was, or like, this name's weird. There's a lot of that as a commentary. So when it came time to actually writing the dissertation, there was a lot of it that did not make it into the actual document, which kind of bummed me out, because I thought, oh, I've done all this work. What am I going to do? I don't get to use it. I did get to use it eventually, but not then. But it was all in one place, and it didn't waste time, because I'm this person. You can start flipping back through the book, and you're like, oh, let me read this for the 1,000th time. Oh, this is interesting. It was a total procrastination move to go back into the research and go wandering around. If I had it in my notebook, and I did this with primary text too, all the cool quotations, I didn't have to go flipping through a bunch of stuff or looking on my computer file. Where did I save that? That's a weird title for this, like, bad at labeling things on my computer. It's all in the document. If the internet wasn't working, I had it right there. So that's just a quick pitch for an organization method that worked for me. Whatever you pick, I'm sure it'll be amazing. So